Hunter, what if I'm gonna throw a what if question at you right from the beginning.
Let's do it.
What if we only taught geography in school? No math, no algebra, maybe history, but geographic history.
Right.
No science, just geography. Do you think we would get beyond in public school today? Do you think we would get beyond kids just learning the capitals of states?
Right. That would be probably one of the biggest knock-on effects, is that people wouldn't think geography is that one day in 8th grade where you learn state capitals. I'm definitely an advocate of more geography, although even as a professional geographer, I'd have to hesitate that it would be it being the only discipline would be a good idea.
That's a good thing.
I think you need some of that other stuff in the mix. But certainly, yeah, more than that one day in 8th grade would also be good. So there's got to be a happy medium, maybe.
Yeah, well, you have kids in school. Do they learn a lot of geography, or is it still pretty basic from when I was?
They learn some. I feel like it's maybe a little bit more than we did, but not really much more. I mean, I think that there's a lot of in the common curriculum. They have to make sure that their students are doing well on particular standardized tests and things like that. And there's no geography on that.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
So
I don't remember there being any. That's for sure.
So I don't think, in the elementary school, certainly, or middle school, there's a whole lot of emphasis on geography, which there could be. There could
be more. Welcome to What If Geography. I just threw a totally unexpected what if question at Hunter.
I was not expecting that. That's true.
Didn't plan it. Didn't prepare. Well, I sort of thought about it like the last 30 minutes or so before we hit the record button. But I think we typically talk a little bit about how geography is not just place names, because that's typically what grade schools, at least here in the United States, are taught. And I think people from the United States have a stereotype within the world is not really knowing geography all that well.
Yeah. I mean, there's some statistics, I think, that back that up. I don't know if there's any recent ones, but, the National Geographic did a study a while back, which suggested that, students can't locate much on a map, don't have a lot of cartographic literacy, that kind of thing. Whereas in other countries, geography is kind of like history. It's something that you take every year, and it doesn't seem like such a one-off.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, famously, like Oxford University has like a, world-renowned geography, whatever. Like it's like the geography university if you want to do like world geography stuff.
I lived in Belgium for a year, and I went to a year of high school there, and geography was just a regular class, just a regular offering. In fact, that's maybe part of what got me hooked. I'm like, this is a thing.
It can actually be a thing that people actually.
I kind of liked it, and then so when I went to college, I had my eye open for that.
Well, we are here talking geography. We do geography for a living.
That's right.
Geographize. We geography the world.
That's right.
We do a podcast on geography, which is why you're listening here. We're just, I guess broadly today we're going to talk a little bit about, Hunter, this is your topic.
So what if plastic had never been invented? That is the question of the day.
Phenomenal question, right? There's so many implications there, which means that the what if part of this, I think, is going to get really fun and probably really, they're always very speculative because obviously how could they be anything else?
There's a lot to say about this particular what if, I think.
Yeah, there's a
shout out to my friend Eli for suggesting this topic, by the way. So it can happen. If you give us an idea, we might follow it up. And
thanks, Eli.
He said, hey, what about an episode about if there had never been plastic? And then the giant light bulb went on over my head. And I remember mentioning it to you, and you said, that's a great idea. So here we are.
Awesome idea. Yeah. So I'll go ahead and kick us off with some introductions. My name's Geoff Gibson. I am co-host of this podcast that you're listening to right now. You can find me typically on YouTube at Geography by Geoff, where I do other sort of YouTube things and do geography stuff there. You can also find me on Substack, geographybygeoff.substack.com. I always qualify it. I'm a Geoff, G-O-G-O. It usually helps people remember.
Geoff with a G.
Geoff with a G, yeah. Which I do meet, other Geoffs around.
I know some others.
Yeah. But it's pretty rare. We give each other high fives.
Right. There's a handshake, probably. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's me, and we'll do more pluggables at the end. So, Hunter?
I'm Hunter Shoby. I'm the other co-host of What If Geography here, the podcast. I'm a professor of geography at Portland State University and author of a couple cultural atlases, Portlandist, a cultural atlas, and Upper Left Cities, a cultural atlas of San Francisco, Portland, and Seattle, co-authored by David Banas.
Great. Yeah. And so before we get into today's episode, just a couple quick sort of housekeeping things. The first is we're trying to do this new push where we get people to review us on Apple Podcasts.
Right. Especially if they like it.
Well, yeah, especially if you like it. Please, go and review it and give us a, whatever star, 5-star. Give us a 5-star.
That would be great.
4 stars, fine too, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, don't lie if you don't really feel that way, but we're hoping that, yeah.
Exactly, yeah. If you can find it within your heart that you really love us, then 5 stars. I don't know if that changes anything, but it's kind of nice to see every once in a while. The other thing is that we are, I guess first, I have redone the whatifgeography.com website.
Oh, excellent.
So now it's kind of cool. It's very sort of minimalist, just has the latest episode, and there are a bunch of links to a bunch of different stuff that we do. And then if you look right underneath that little player on the thing, there's a little form now that you can sort of ask us a question.
Ask a geographer.
Yeah, ask a geographer. And so if you do have a question, we're starting to pull some of those together just to, I don't know, I guess kind of just have in our back pocket to pull together an Ask a Geographer kind of episode. We can kind of do them every once in a while as questions come in, as we think we have enough of interesting questions to tackle. This can be anything. It can be cultural geography. If you're interested in sort of why, a certain island does a certain thing, sure, ask that. There's really no bounds.
Environmental, physical geography. Mm-hmm. We'll do our best with whatever questions you might have.
Exactly. So please go to whatifgeography.com. Drop a question in there if you have them. It's fun to it's fun to engage with sort of the people who listen as much as we're able to, right? Like me and Hunter are just sitting here by ourselves. We don't have an audience. So this is how we kind of have to do it.
That's the modern era, right?
Yeah. And I think with that, I guess we can just sort of launch into today's episode. I think it's going to be a meaty one.
Yeah, heavy. I think there's a lot to say. There's a lot of, as there often is, there's a lot of history. And the history, when I was researching this, Geoff, there's just a lot of things I didn't know that I found out about that was really interesting. So we'll share a lot of that stuff. Mm-hmm. I'm also not particularly well-versed in chemistry myself. And
Me either.
I found very quickly that would have been useful, for this episode. So we won't get too deep into the science of it, but there is a whole interesting side of that it's pretty complicated, and plastics are very diverse in terms of the way that they're made up and everything like that. And so that'll obviously materialize in some way in our conversation here. But
just like I wasn't a nuclear physicist when I led our
right.
nuclear
These are the limits
energy.
of being generalists, but then we get to the positive thing is that we get to talk about lots of different things. So let's get into it. What if plastic had never been invented? Plastic, if you look at the original meaning of the term, it means pliable or easily shaped.
Okay.
Right?
Makes sense.
Sort of makes
I would
sense.
say plastic is both pliable and easily shaped. It comes in a million different things, right? We molded it.
That's right. And that's
basically everything.
That's the big advantage, right? And so plastics, what they have going for them, and they're inexpensive. They're pretty durable. Mm-hmm. They can be made into almost anything in almost any color.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. Right. So I guess I'm thinking, I think plastic broadly is at this point in everything, right? I'm looking at a screen door in my house right now, and I'm sure there's some plastic on it. Actually, I see some plastic.
We would have houses without plastic, but they would be different.
They'd be different. Yeah. Which I think we're going to get to.
That's right.
We're going to get to some of these uses of plastic, but I think it's widespread. It's a myriad of different types of uses. And, I always think back to Tupperware.
Yes.
Which
we'll talk about Tupperware. Yeah.
Yeah. Which is these weird little, it's just kind of like any old storage container.
Right. But that was when that was launched, that was a new thing in people's lives, and as a way of preserving food. And
right.
It's sort of got its own cultural history as well, mm-hmm. which would be interesting to get into. So if we talk a little bit more about the meaning of the word plastic, apparently it's derived from a Greek word plasine, to mold or shape, right? So that fits with what we just said.
That makes sense, yeah.
But today, I guess a real basic general definition would be it's a general term for materials that are formed under heat and pressure.
Okay. Well, wouldn't that be...
I guess
there's a lot of things that are formed under heat and pressure, right?
Yeah, I guess that's true. Steel is as well. Yeah. And that's not plastic, so maybe we'll have to come up with a better definition.
Not our job, it's their job.
I suppose that's true. Well, we can say that most of today's plastics are made of hydrocarbon molecules, carbon and hydrogen, that are derived from refining oil and natural gas. So that's something that characterizes most of the plastics that we encounter today.
Which I actually don't think a lot of people know, that plastics are a product of basically oil.
Right. And that they don't absolutely have to be, but almost all the plastics we encounter are. Mm-hmm. And that will figure very prominently in our story as we move forward. It's an important thing to know. Just also in terms of overview here, plastic also has a different sort of cultural baggage attached to it. Like if you were to call somebody plastic or something plastic, that wouldn't be a compliment. So starting in the 1960s, plastic started to become synonymous with cheap, fake, superficial. So it didn't take long after it began to be mass produced for it to take on this sort of negative meaning. Concerns about plastic waste and pollution, which we'll talk about a bit later, really cropped up in the late 60s, early 1970s, and moving into the 1980s and on. So didn't take long after the mass production of plastic for it to be a concern.
And now we're talking about a whole other kind of, which I'm assuming we're going to get to as well, a whole other kind of plastic pollution, which is like microplastic.
That's right. Yeah, we'll obviously talk about that a little bit because that's a big concern and something that is on a lot of people's minds. There's a term here I came across when I was researching polymers, which I'm like, I think I know what that is. And then I realized I only sort of knew what that was.
Can I guess?
Sure.
I think, so maybe I'm going to be way off. A polymer, is that when you take two separate materials to make into like one?
Ooh, that's pretty good.
Is that good?
Yeah, that's really good. The definition I have, poly is the key to that, right? Polymer is a substance that has a molecular structure consisting chiefly or entirely of a large number of similar units that are bonded together. So that's pretty much what you said.
That's pretty good. Yeah. Mine was the layman's version, but yeah.
A shorthand for polymers, it's a chemical class of materials that make up modern plastics. But there are natural polymers as well. So maybe we should mention what some of those are, because that's important to know. In other words, what a lot of synthetic polymers or plastic replaced. Right?
Yeah.
So silk.
Oh, interesting.
Is a natural polymer.
Wait, so that comes out of like a bug or something?
Yeah, it comes out of a silkworm, which is actually a caterpillar, it turns out, that feeds mostly on mulberry leaves from a mulberry tree. So that's what silk is, and was a very important substance for making fabric. Rubber.
Okay, yeah.
Is a natural polymer.
Rubber tree. That's also, it comes from the rubber tree, but is what else, do we know what goes into that?
I'm not sure what else goes into that.
Yeah. I'm going to assume everything is oil.
Right. There is cellulose, which is a structural component of primary cell walls of green plants and algae. So it can be used to make waterproof fabrics. So that's a natural polymer. There's amber.
Amber? It's like a stone, right?
Yeah, it's sort of, they find...
Oh, wait, Jurassic Park?
Yeah, that's a lot of people's familiarity with amber extends to Jurassic Park, and that's how we're making, we can make dinosaurs because it preserves things inside, and that ability to protect or preserve something is something that was very desirable for people. Yeah. Starches as well, and then shellac.
Shellac?
That's right.
Like, I'm going to shellac you?
Right, but shellac, we usually think of something that is... synthetically created. But the original shellac is a resin secreted by an insect and was originally used as a natural
electrical insulator. Oh, that's kind of cool.
Yeah, this is also foreshadowing for some of the important roles.
What we would do now, what we now have is we have plastic, we have plastic housing around wires.
That's right.
Yeah.
Which is, as we're going to get to it, that's a very important... in the modern world, a very important function of plastic.
Yeah. I think, just, probably not even any foreshadowing needed. Not to jump the gun, but I think it's pretty safe to say that life today would be dramatically different without plastics.
It would be... one of the things I read suggested that without plastics, technologically speaking, we would sort of be in the 1870s still in some ways.
Wow.
And that may be a stretch, but there's a lot of things that we are using for this podcast that we all use on a daily basis that we would either not have, or would be a lot more expensive, or it would be very different if it weren't for plastic.
Yeah, no, I definitely see that, and I can't wait to get to that point.
I thought I would mention what the three most commonly produced plastics are.
Okay.
There's PVC, which you probably all heard of before,
yeah.
right?
So I've heard that PVC is, well, I think it's one of the most durable forms of plastic. You can get like PVC piping.
Yep.
Right. I think typically if you get like new pipes installed in your house, they're no longer steel or anything like that. They're PVC.
That's correct, right? So which means we could have pipes without plastic, but it would be different and it would be more expensive. Polyethylene is I'm sorry. So PVC is the third most commonly produced plastic. The second one is polypropylene, and then polyethylene, and we'll revisit some of these in a moment, is the world's most commonly produced plastic. But the point is that there's a lot of different forms. They're all made a little bit different. They have different points at which they can melt and be formed into things. And so that's one of the things that makes them distinct from one another. But maybe the next question that we should use to prompt ourselves forward is, why innovate synthetic plastics at all? Like, what was the motivation for having them?
No, that's a great question, right? Who had the idea that this was even something that the world needed? Because I mean, I guess like when you get into it and you start seeing how it's being used and everything, it becomes pretty obvious the advantage of it. But when you're just sort of pulling together this weird material and you're like, oh, this is kind of neat. And like, yeah, it's kind of like bendy and durable.
Right.
Like, but
right,
like
before we had it, somebody has to innovate that. So what were the motivations for innovating something like this? So let's take a look at what some sort of natural polymers or plastics are. Horn. So like elephant tusks in particular. So ivory was a very important substance for things like piano keys. Billiard balls actually were made of ivory, which is very interesting. In fact,
you don't think there being that much ivory in the world.
Well, that's exactly it. And so because ivory started becoming scarce and the elephants were starting to be slaughtered in massive numbers and still are, right? That was part of the motivation for wanting to get past it. Tortoise shell?
No, what is that?
The shell of a turtle.
Oh, like a literal tortoise shell.
Yeah, right. Okay. So that's also a design that you can get on your glasses, but early glasses might have been made out of something like that. And so it's something that's pliable enough to use. And so that's another, we're talking about, I hate to say natural resources because that's kind of a slander to elephants and turtles, but that's sometimes what it gets reduced to. Amber, rubber, and shellac, the things that we just mentioned, are all natural plastics, and they were used to make things like combs. And I mentioned combs because in the early years, plastic combs was like sort of a revelation. And apparently combs are some of the oldest tools in human history and would have been made out of horn or bone or something like that. So that's some of the early stuff. Elephants and some species of turtles were threatened due to the use of ivory and tortoise shell, as I mentioned before. And so part of the initial motivations, that led to the creation of plastics was finding an alternative to some of these things, finding an alternative to ivory, to tortoise shell, to rubber, and to wood as well, because these are limited resources, which we started using very extensively. The rise of plastics can be seen with accompanying the rise of industrialization, not the earliest industrialization of the 1700s, but more the classic era of industrialization in the mid to late 1800s into the 1900s.
Wait, you're saying that plastic first came around in the mid 1800s?
Yes, and I'll get into some examples of that. And we're talking at that point about semi-synthetic, so things that were, and I'll make a distinction between what is fully synthetic and what is partially synthetic.
It's just kind of amazing because I think if you asked most people, even people who were, at least tangentially aware of sort of like, the history or sort of like what plastic is and does and how it impacts the world, I think most people would say plastic is a 20th century technology, not a 19th century, not from like, when we're making the Transcontinental Railroad.
In a sense, fully synthetic plastics are a 20th century innovation, but we really do need to go into the 1800s to really understand the trajectory of what became the fully synthetic plastics that we know today. it's important, and going back to industrialization for just a moment, it's important to understand that part of industrialization was the rise of a consumer economy, right? Where people
makes sense.
bought things that people in the past largely had to make for themselves. So it allowed people to specialize a lot more, and not everybody has to do everything on their own. Of course, there was specialization before, but the rise of a consumer society, industrialization, means that people don't have to know how to make a lot of stuff necessarily, because a lot of that stuff is mass produced.
You can buy a chair. You don't have to know how to make
That's
a chair,
right.
which I don't know if you know, as you're listening to this, making a chair apparently is actually pretty hard.
I've not made a chair. And this is
I've
a
not
perfect
made a chair
example, right?
either,
but
but
if you
I've
go
heard-
back 200 years, if you wanted a chair, you either had to make one yourself or be able to barter for one or something like that. And then the other part of this is that some products that had been available exclusively to the wealthy, so maybe that's our billiard balls and our ivory for piano and that kind of thing. Increasingly, with industrialization, these become more affordable to the middle class.
Okay.
And so that really kind of twins with what happens with plastics as well.
Well, it seems to kind of rise with the middle class, right? Because middle class kind of comes with the period of industrialization.
That's right.
Into like, well, I don't know specifically, but I feel like certainly a time right before the Great Depression, there was a pretty robust middle class that then kind of went away for a little while.
And then took off in a massive way after World War II. So all right, 1800s, semi-synthetics, early human-made plastics, polystyrene, which really didn't become practical material for manufacture until the 1930s, was apparently actually innovated in its earliest form in 1839.
Wow. Okay.
This was done by someone who worked in an apothecary in Berlin, Edward Simon, apparently. It was called citraloxide at the time, which, polystyrene is not the easiest thing to wrap your tongue around, but this one's even more difficult. But what's sometimes credited as being the first human-made plastic, and this isn't fully synthetic, which means they're not completely making things that don't exist in a state of nature, is parkasine, which was innovated in 1855, patented in 1862 by a British individual named Alexander Parkes. And of course, this most of that name of that plastic has got his last name in it, right? So that's what you do. You name it for yourself. And so he patented this thing called parkasine as a precursor to modern synthetic plastic. It was derived from cellulose, which again is that the cell wall of green plants. And
which I think really quick before we move on, cellulose I feel like you'll see occasionally at I feel like you go to Starbucks and you get like an iced tea or something like that, and it comes in a little plastic cup that is like says compostable,
right?
And it's like plastic made from plants. I'm assuming that's cellulose.
That could be, although I will say that even those kinds, I'm not sure specifically about that one, but most paper cups are lined with plastic because otherwise, paper can't really hold water that well. So
it can't hold water.
It's not magic,
and
right?
Especially not hot water.
Right. So there is some small amount of plastic involved there. If we look into what happens with parkasine, eventually somebody named John Wesley Hyatt takes over this patent. And he is one of the people who's accepting this sort of challenge to make billiard balls out of something other than ivory. And this is where we start to get something called celluloid or cellulose nitrate, which is made by mixing nitrocellulose and camphor, which I'm not exactly sure what that is. Right? And again, this was all motivated by the desire to replace ivory. And I think it was if we jump ahead just a little bit, because a lot of people might think of celluloid in terms with movie and photographic film. So this is something that eventually will become made into film for movies or for still photography. But it's very expensive and it's unstable and highly flammable. And so there's, examples of just old film reels just sort of spontaneously combusting and things like this. So this isn't a particularly viable substance in the modern age. So eventually, that gets replaced.
I've definitely seen some. I think there's been dramatizations in various movies over the years, but harkening back to this period, where film was this material that, it was just like you said, it could it gets a little too hot, and all of a sudden, poof,
That's right.
now your entire theater's going up in smoke.
And some people who collect old films, and some films are only made on this in this substance, celluloid, and so they're having to preserve it in certain ways, and it's very unstable. So
Yeah.
we've gotten past that.
Yeah. So there's still a lot of history that we need to get through. Before we keep going, we need to do a really quick ad break so that we can make some money.
Let's come back in a few moments. And we're back talking about what if plastic had never been invented on the What If Geography podcast.
Big subject.
We were going through history, right? We talked about Parkisane and celluloid, which are some of the earliest human-made semi-synthetic plastics. We mentioned PVC at the top of the broadcast here, which is polyvinyl chloride, which was created initially in 1872, and a fully plasticized version, which resembles more what we have today, was then created in 1926. So some of these things, innovations are started up, and then somebody else plays around with it and makes it a little bit more viable.
Makes sense.
And so that's part of the reason why I think it's interesting to go into some of this history. We have viscose rayon, invented by Charles Frederick Cross and Edward John Bevan in 1894. So we're starting to think about fabrics and these kinds of things.
Interesting. All the way back then.
Yeah, and I'm not sure it becomes...
Because like nylon.
It's, right. This nylon comes a little bit later. And again, I think this is one of the earliest incarnations of it. It's not quite... there's one thing to innovate something, and then there's another thing to get a patent on it.
Right.
And then there's another thing to be able to turn it into a mass-produced good. And so those are different moments. So sometimes when you're doing this research, you have dates that sort of conflict with one another, because some people are using the initial discovery or innovation, and some people are using when it was patented. So that's why there's some differences sometimes in this stuff.
Well, I think this sort of what you're describing that's a pretty typical pattern for basically a lot of new inventions, right? And I think that's why often today you'll hear about some new technology that scientists have invented, and then you don't hear anything about it. Like I think I've heard about human hair being able to generate electricity in solar cells or something like that. I don't know if that's actually true, but something like that. But then you just don't hear anything about it, and it's like, okay, well, did that actually happen? But I think it's
right.
It has to go through
like doing something once in a lab is different than being able to have it in your house.
Yeah, have mass market, have to be able to scale up, do all this kind of stuff. There's a process and a geography to all of this that something has to make it all the way through all those checks before it actually is viable in sort of a mainstream consumer technology, which plastics obviously did make it to that point.
That's right. That's exactly right. And now they've become so common, as we've been talking about. So we are getting into the 1900s, the 20th century now, which is really the time when plastic really took off and became something that could be used and fabricated in such a way that a lot of people could have it, right? And so we're talking about synthetic plastic, which means it contains no molecules found in nature, right? So you need a laboratory in order to create these things. For example, Teflon, which was innovated, nothing sticks, well, not nothing, but most things don't stick to Teflon, right?
Teflon, is that the stuff that's like you have a non-stick pan?
For example.
Okay.
Yeah,
cool.
exactly.
Right
and that'll come up when we talk about the World War II era. There's an interesting connection with Teflon we'll want to talk about. Kevlar, which comes out much later as well, can stop a bullet.
That's a bullet stopper.
Right, yeah, exactly.
Wait, that's plastic?
Well, it's a form of plastic, apparently.
Really?
Yeah.
Because bullets are not plastic.
No, they're not. But what else would Kevlar be, really, right?
I mean, I guess, yeah. And, after we've already sort of talked about sort of like the basics of what plastic is, very malleable, very durable.
Right.
Yeah, you would need something that's both malleable and durable because it needs to absorb a lot of, pressure of, this metal thing.
It's got to be wearable too. Unlike, steel, wearable, not highly wearable.
That's true. Yeah.
Not fashionable. So the big moment comes in 1907 with the first fully synthetic plastic innovated by Belgian-born U.S. chemist Leo Baekeland, who invents Bakelite.
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 Everything's named after somebody.
Right. Apparently, this was innovated in New York, and it is the first fully synthetic resin or plastic to become commercially successful. So we have all these other examples before that I mentioned. They're semi-synthetic and that kind of thing. But this is sometimes referred to as the first true plastic. It is not derived from plant or animal material, but rather derived from fossil fuels.
Okay, yeah. So now we're getting into oil and petroleum based.
What we usually think about when we think about plastics, a polymer created entirely in a laboratory.
Yeah.
And Bakelite was looking for a synthetic substitute for shellac, which we mentioned was this resin secreted by this particular insect. It's a natural electrical insulator. And as Leo is looking at the rise of electricity and the development of electricity in the United States, there's a need for insulators, for wires. And so trying to come up with something that can replace shellac is part of the motivation for making Bakelite. And so two chemicals, formaldehyde and phenol, which is a waste product of coal, are combined under heat and pressure to create Bakelite.
Wow, okay. So a waste product from coal.
And formaldehyde.
That sounds very healthy.
Right. I mean, somebody had to experiment with this stuff. The advantage over celluloid, which we talked about just before, was that it could be easily molded in just about anything. So apparently celluloid wasn't quite as malleable, and Bakelite proved to be very malleable. It was durable. It was heat resistant and well suited to mechanical mass production. And one of the things that it was used to make initially, among other things, was telephones and radios. And so, if you are somebody who you're in a picker, you're going to find some old timey type things, you might be looking for a Bakelite telephone or radio that is old school plastic.
Yeah. So, and one of my friends here has an old apartment, probably built in, early 1900s. And on her wall is literally a sort of old telephone system that I don't know why it still exists there. I mean, it's kind of cool now, right?
Some people just kept leaving it there.
Yeah.
Basically.
I mean, this has to have been very intentional on the part of the managers, but yeah, it's a plastic-like material. I wouldn't say it feels like the same, I have like my phone in my hand with like my case on it. That feels very plasticky. This doesn't feel exactly the same, but it doesn't, it's not steel. It's not some sort of metal. It's clearly something else.
Right.
Yeah.
A lot of times we just don't even think about it, right? Yeah.
Exactly.
So Bakelite was a game changer because it was entirely synthetic. And with the innovation of this, others who are trying to do similar things, the emphasis becomes less on replacing natural materials, like ivory or tortoiseshell or something like that, and more on creating just new materials that haven't existed before. So instead of replacing something, coming up with something new. Here's a new term. Bakelite is a thermoset plastic. And what thermoset plastic means is that it can't be melted down to make something new.
Oh, I think that's going to be very important when we start talking about recycling.
That's pretty key for the recycling conversation. And that's interesting. That's distinct from thermoplastics, which sound very similar. There's thermoset, but then thermoplastics can be melted and reformed. So
thermoset, as in
it's
the
set.
Fire
right?
is
That's
set.
it. It's done. It can't
been
be
molded.
It can't be viably turned into something else.
Yeah.
Thermoplastics can be melted and reformed. Little spoiler alert for what's going to come for the recycling conversation is that the thermoplastics really can only happen one or two times, right? It can only be melted down and reformed maybe once or twice. And after that, it just degrades too much to become viable to turn into anything else. So that's an important thing that we'll get back to. Let's see. Innovated after this were the thermoplastics, as we're talking about, which can be melted down, reformed into something new. Today, some 90% of plastics created are thermoplastics. So most plastics that you encounter in your home or in your work or transportation or anything like that are going to be the kind that can be melted down and reformed into something new. Although it's a little bit misleading to say that because it makes it sound like it's easy.
Right.
It's not. We'll save that for a little bit later, but that's something you should know. The other thing that's important to talk about on the business side of things, that some of the companies that were early to plastic creation include ones that you've heard of before. Dow, ExxonMobil, DuPont, BASF, right? So these
all the great beneficial companies of the world.
Well, these are there. There's been a lot of positive things, but there are also companies that come in for a lot of criticism because they deal with chemicals and fossil fuels.
Right.
Yes. So, in other words, these were major players from pretty early on. So, cellophane, right, which eventually becomes Saran wrap.
That's what I was gonna say. It's like that stretchy stuff that you put over like a bowl of chowder.
Right. Chowder, example, right? We should have a chowder episode. I feel like. What if there was no chowder in the world? Somewhere somebody in New England's like, what? No. So cellophane originally was created in 1908. Again, that doesn't mean that Saran wrap came out in stores the next day, but that was a product made by scientists at Dow.
Yeah. Stretchy plastic.
That's right. Yeah. Nylon.
No. So, okay. So we talked about that's like
1935, right? Wow. Which becomes one of the first synthetic fabrics, I think. DuPont is the company that's where that was first innovated. Teflon.
Yeah.
Which it's all, or PTFE, and I'm not sure I can really, let me give this a shot. Polytetrafluoroethylene.
Oh, I think that's pretty good.
Let's just do that once, right? And from here forward to Teflon, right? Was
we'll use the brand
discovered by accident. You know how that happens in labs? Right. It feels like I think penicillin is one of those things where it's like somebody turns their back and they come back, they're like, uh-oh.
Yeah.
And then they realize, nothing sticks to this thing. And that was in 1938. DuPont was the auspices under when that came around. 1935. Okay, so nylon. Well, Wallace Carruthers is the name of the person who invented it, and it was to function as a synthetic silk, right? Because silk it's famously expensive, right?
Yeah.
You mentioned the Silk Road and the idea that when you're trading over very long distances overland, you would need something that's very precious in order to justify making that journey.
Well, and I think and correct me if I'm wrong, but nylon is that also stretchy plastic material?
I believe that it is. Yeah.
Because there's some form of, if I think broadly, and we'll probably talk about this, later on this episode or maybe into part 2. I think there's, I think generally if you look at any clothing that you own, it's going to be, maybe it'll be some percent cotton. I think usually it's some sort of blend, and I think usually it's nylon. That's
right. That gives it some elasticity.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Which people like.
Yeah, which there's an advantage to that, right? I mean, if we were all wearing regular denim like back in the day, it's not quite the same as most of the denim that we're wearing today, which is a little bit more forgiving,
Yeah. We can keep going.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the World War II era, because that becomes pretty important for setting up the mass production of plastic in the 1950s and 60s.
And so we're going to talk about World War II as in plastics within the war itself?
Yeah. So
right, cool.
One of the things is that plastic production increases massively during World War II. One of the estimates I saw, and again, I don't know if this is by 300%.
Okay.
Right. So during the war effort, United States increases production of plastics by 300%. It begins to replace glass, metal, and paper, which are much more expensive to produce. Right. So that's one of the things that plastics has going for it, is it's cheap to make. It's famously cheap to make, right?
Is this something that during the war, it was a U.S. advantage? Did the Axis powers have plastic as well? Do we know that?
I don't. We people know that, but I don't think you and I know that, right?
I'm sure. Yeah, I'm sure there's definitely got to be somebody out there who knows. But that would be interesting, right? Because think about the advantages. Would that have, if not to jump ahead to our what ifs, but would that have given a particular advantage to the U.S.?
Well, I think that we're about to get to part of the story that will suggest that it does. Okay.
Cool. Right on.
So plastics became an important part of the war effort. And here are some of the things that plastics were used for. Mortar fuses.
Okay.
Parachutes, which used to be made out of silk.
Okay. Yeah.
Aircraft parts.
That makes sense.
Bazooka barrels.
Oh, interesting. Really? That one surprises me. Because I feel like you would want this big fiery rocket shooting out of your shoulder. You want that to be
I guess
metal.
There's probably a combination of things, right? A lot of these things are a combination of materials. gun turret enclosures,
Okay.
helmet liners.
That makes sense.
We have plexiglass, right, which is a substitute for glass, which started to be used in aircraft windows. And so here's the story that I was fascinated by. And apparently plastics were instrumental in developing the atom bomb.
Interesting.
Teflon in particular, because Teflon was used for the containers to coat valves and seals for the very volatile gases that were employed by Manhattan Project scientists.
Interesting.
So, I mean, I guess, and this is kind of a what if thing, but we're talking about it. Would there be an atom bomb without Teflon or plastics? Maybe there would have been. Maybe they would have gotten there, but it would have been a much more dangerous. I mean, what could be more dangerous than an atom bomb? But just the process of creating it might have been prohibitive.
Yeah, interesting. I'm curious because we already sort of talked about Teflon, and basically it's the stuff that goes on like our pans, and you can cook eggs and you don't need oil or something. In theory, I don't know if that actually is how it works, but I'm trying to think of what within the process of a nuclear bomb would need something that's non-stick. Maybe it's just because it's
I think the gases to be able to, I don't really, I'm based on my very basic research on this particular aspect of this, is that these gases, it's just beneficial for them to be in a container made of Teflon so that it transitions smoothly from, through the valves, through the seals, it doesn't leak. It's a way of containing things effectively. That's what I'm getting from it.
Wild. Like, who thinks of this? Who's like, well, let's take this material that we just sort of invented and we know that's non-stick.
20 years ago.
Let's see what happens, you know?
So next time you're making eggs on a Teflon pan, think about some of the other uses for this. The other thing is that after World War II, plastic products just exploded on the market for consumer society.
And with that, before we jump to post-World War II, if we're about to hit that, let's run some ads. Because I think this can be fun, because I think we're going to get to the part where we're going to start talking about a lot of the stuff that generally everybody here is going to start realizing and understanding and sort of conceptualizing. And
that's right.
Yeah. No interruptions during that.
Okay, right. Good point.
All right, here we go. And we're back. We're going to just continue talking about plastics, and we just left World War II behind, and we're going to head into the wonderful era of the 50s.
That's right.
Or I guess late 40s. But.
Yeah, all right. So here's something we talked about before. Tupperware went on the market in 1948, right?
Oh, wow. Okay.
So this is a way that people maybe started getting plastics in their home already, but this was a very obvious sort of conscious sort of thing. It's like, oh, here's a material that I'm not really used to before. I put my food in it and put it in the refrigerator. Tupperware, 1948. 1953 is when Dow puts saran wrap on the market. So although that was innovated years before for it to be turned into something that could be mass produced.
If we can go back to Tupperware for just a quick second.
Oh yeah, let's not leave Tupperware.
Because so I have this idea in my head, and it could be off, but I kind of feel like so we know of these various sort of organizations where it's like I guess commonly we would broadly think of them today as more like multi-level marketing sort of things. But I don't know if that's how they all started. Maybe they did. But I think Tupperware is one of the more famous earlier versions of you're a Tupperware person and you host Tupperware parties.
That's right.
And people come over to your house and they see the wonders of Tupperware.
Right, yeah. and this sort of fits with that suburban kind of aesthetic.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So there's like some vivid images in my head, probably some TV show or documentary I watched at one point, but it's basically, it's like a bunch of, suburban sort of looking people inside some sort of living room. Looks like a very suburban house, and there's like
fascinated by this new
thing. Yes. Yep. Now all of a sudden it's like, well, why would you keep your cereal inside this box when you could buy this plastic container and pour all your cereal in there?
Right. That's right. Yeah, and we're talking about mass producing. This is part of mass producing food, right? Yeah. And sort of the industrialization of food, because, and this is a little bit to the side, but it was petrochemicalization was the 1940s, which is when we started also using fossil fuel derived insecticides, pesticides, fertilizers on our food. So we're growing our food with oil-based products, and then we make the food, and then we put it in an oil-based product in order to store it.
Nice.
Yeah. Plastic also starts to be used for disposable products like packaging and single-use bags. And that's something that's going to come back to be a major issue.
Yeah, I do know. I have a fun, maybe little sidebar story. Maybe we'll get to it. Maybe it was already on the docket. But I do remember or recall there was a shift from paper bags to plastic bags somewhere in the 80s.
Yeah, that sounds about right. Yeah.
And I know that a lot of particularly more progressive cities were sort of at the forefront of this switch, because the idea was that, we can use plastic bags and we'll save trees and paper, because that time that was seen as like very wasteful.
Right.
And now it's like gone full circle and we're back.
Now we're trying to use paper instead, right?
Go back to paper.
Or if you use a bag that you buy for 50 cents or $1 so you can reuse it. Right. It's made out of plastic, and a lot of energy goes into making those bags.
Yeah.
So Tupperware, Saran wrap, 1953, 1954, styrofoam produced by Dow, and all these things do relate to the food industry.
Right.
And the thing that's driving even your example with replacing paper with plastic is that it's very inexpensive to make. It's safe, sanitary, easy to be shaped in whatever people want. I mean, these are the advantages of plastic in this new consumer society in the United States, which, of course, we should probably say that not everybody's benefiting from equally.
Right.
However, there is a increase in disposable income for many individuals, and plastics become a part of that as well. Mm-hmm. But then it doesn't take long for all this stuff to start causing some concerns.
Right. I mean, I think most people today would probably think that's obvious. Well, obviously, plastics, are bad, or plastics don't go away. I think, but however, if you go back to like, the 40s and 50s, or even before then, I guess 40s and 50s is probably when it started getting more mass appeal. But I don't think there wasn't that obvious, like, oh, this is bad for the environment. Nobody's thinking about things in that way yet.
Right. Not initially.
Yeah.
But by the 1960s, that starts to become a concern, right? And so some of the big advantages and benefits of plastic also become what detracts from them, or becomes some of their issues. And part of it is their disposability, right? A big problem with plastics is that you get something that's plastic, you use it once, and you get rid of it. And we'll get to the recycling thing later. Mm-hmm. But the disposability became a really big issue. So it's an attractive material to use for manufacturing for these reasons. But in fact, many plastics can take thousands or tens of thousands of years to degrade.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think we've heard, again, I think going back to these, like, magic technologies that we hear about, but then like seem to never like peter out, or, whatever, I think we've constantly heard about over the years of like scientists figuring out, such and such bacteria or such and such microbe can devour and like decompose plastics in a much faster timeline.
Right. And that's part of what there's some hope there.
There's some hope there, right?
That things could be made more plant-based, or maybe there's some animals that can eat it, or some, all kinds of ideas and how we can, none of that addresses consuming less.
No, exactly. And I think that's a big part of this. It's like, well, okay, yes, that's great. And we need to do this, right? It's like, yes, we, it's like having like electric cars. Yes, electric cars are great, and we also probably need less cars overall because we have a lot of cars. Right. So coming up with biofuel, it doesn't eliminate, for example, the dependency on the automobile. Right. Exactly.
So as early as the 1960s, people are starting to observe plastic waste in the oceans, right?
Okay.
So that's already going back into the 60s.
Right. Okay. So we have our. Okay, so we're probably not talking about the great big garbage patch yet.
We're not talking about that yet.
But this is like, people are noticing, oh, here's like a little plastic bottle floating.
Or like plastic bags or things like that. And that this is, so the contemporary environmental movement in the United States, at least, really has its nascence in the 1960s. And of course, in the early 1970s, it really takes off. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring was published in 1962, which brings attention to things like the dangers of chemical pesticides. And so this is, obliquely related to plastics, which is also something that's derived from petroleum.
Well, and at some point, maybe it's during this time, this is when, so like you get a 6-pack of, whatever, sodas or beer from the store. And still, even to this day, many of them have those little plastic rings around it that keep all 6 attached to each other.
Right. This was a famous example from the 70s, right?
Okay, from the 70s.
Because there would, the World Wildlife Fund would show, a bird or some animal that's got its head stuck in one of these 6-pack containers, and that became kind of the poster product for what's wrong with plastic.
Right. And so now, like, everybody cuts them all up so something can't get stuck in. But it's like
helping them along to become microplastics.
But it's funny because, like, we do this with the expectation that this thing that we have is gonna get into the ocean. So.
Right. Like, yeah, right. Exactly. It's like, I got to cut it up because when this ends up on a beach, it won't strangle an animal.
It won't strangle an animal.
We had in Ohio, the Cuyahoga River caught fire in 1969.
Oh,
right?
yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so these are some of the things, these pretty large events, and changes that people are noticing, and they're saying, hey, there's some real environmental concerns associated with plastic waste.
Yeah.
Health concerns also are related to the additives in manufacturing of plastics.
Okay.
So you have
very chemically. So
you have classes of plastics that use chemicals that release into the atmosphere and cause pollution, air pollution, and health issues. And so that's yet another vector of the plastic industry that people are starting to become really concerned about in the 1960s and early 1970s.
Does part of this lead to sort of the Clean Air Act? Or is that something entirely different?
I don't know the answer to that question.
Yeah. Somebody else look it up.
Yeah. But certainly this is part of this mentality that, wait a minute, we're starting to go about things in the wrong way. We're becoming a disposable society, and this is a problem. So you have beverage containers, plastic bottles, which are also, receiving a lot of criticism because there's so many of them all over the place. It's made from PET, which is polyethylene terephthalate. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it correct, which apparently is a form of polyester, which I have a hard time wrapping my head around. But it was patented in 1973, although invented, I think, several decades earlier. And by one estimate, 500 billion PET bottles are sold annually. So there's just an enormous amount of production. And the fact that these things can be sold once, glass is so valuable that there's more of a market for it, recycling. Right. And early on, when glass was used, the idea was to return it so that it could be used again. But plastics initially didn't have that dynamic attached to it. It was use it and get rid of it, which makes it different from wood and some of these other things that we're talking about.
I mean, you think of the life cycle of a lot of different materials. And I think historically, it was very much a reuse as much as possible. I think if you even take like a thing of wood, right, you just keep reusing it, and then at some point you just kind of burn it as sort of heat and a power source, right? Whereas plastic is just not. It's not a biofuel. It's not doable, yeah.
And if you think about the difference between what happened, in the 1930s to the 1950s, right? In the 1930s, there's a huge interest in being thrifty, and thrift actually had a very positive connotation with it, which was, being parsimonious, being reusing things, because people were strapped for money, and so if you had something, you were going to use it for something else, and this became a hallmark of what happened in U.S. society after the Great Depression. And I know that my parents were born in the 30s, and so were raised at the tail end of this era by my grandparents, who were really emphasized this idea that you don't throw stuff away, that you use stuff, and because we paid for it, and it's got to be useful in some way. And that's very different from the mentality that emerges in the 1950s, which is that the economy is strong, a lot of people have a lot of disposable income, so we don't have to be concerned, and thrift becomes something that's seen as
like blasé. It's like
or as instead of just common, as something for the poor, which becomes
Yeah.
demonized and this kind of thing. And so there's a very different cultural shift that goes on that accompanies the rise of plastics.
Yeah. Well, I think with that, we've covered a lot of history and some of the concerns.
Getting closer to the modern era here.
We're getting pretty close, and unfortunately, we might have to end it here.
This is a two-parter.
It's a two-parter for sure. Yeah, because we've touched a little bit on recycling here. We've touched a little bit on things here as I've sort of just brought up questions. But I think we're going to launch very heavily into, all of that.
Yeah, more recycling. Talking a little bit more about just trying to assess what plastics are used for, and then having kind of an extra long session on, well, what if?
Yeah, because, and again, I think of plastics as, I guess, plastics basically in everything, right? But I think it's also in a lot of things that people don't even realize that it's in. So I think we're gonna have a lot of fun talking about, a lot of different aspects of geography when we're talking about sort of, well, if this didn't exist, would we be able to do whatever?
Things would be pretty different.
They'd be pretty different. And so with that, we'll go ahead and just do our pluggables. Hunter?
I'm Hunter Shobi, professor of geography at Portland State University, co-author with David Banas of Portlandness, a Cultural Atlas, and Upper Left Cities, a Cultural Atlas of San Francisco, Portland, and Seattle.
Yeah, and my name's Geoff Gibson. You can find me on YouTube at youtube.com/geography by Geoff, or on Substack, geographybygeoff.substack.com. You can probably just Google Geography by Geoff to find me, at all my various places.
It'll come up.
It'll come up. Yeah, I'm assuming. I actually haven't Googled it. But I mean, how many geography?
I feel like I
Geoffs
have. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. This has been a really fun episode. I'm looking forward to the exciting conclusion next week, which Hunter and I are just going to keep recording.
That's right. But for you, join us next week, and thank you for listening.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.